Welcome to DCRI Research Conference. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We have an exciting talk today from a good speaker. Kristin Newby actually has been here with Duke since her internal medicine residency a couple of years ago, and she's now a professor of medicine and co-directs the cardiac care unit. The other thing I wanted to point out, since really most everybody knows her, is that she has been principal investigator of the Murdoch study, which at a certain level is a precursor to the Google work that she's going to talk to us about today. One reminder, when we get to the question and answer, there are microphones in the ceiling. You do not need this thing, so we can just go ahead and get started. Thank you.
So thank you, Doc. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about something that's been a lot of work, but a lot of fun, getting it to the point that it currently is. We're not over the hump yet, but we're really making great progress. So I hope you'll find this exciting. I think there's something in this for everyone. So with that, let me talk a little bit about the baseline study. These are my disclosures. So the overall premise is that health and disease reflect a complex interplay of biology, environment, socioeconomic and cultural influences, and importantly, time. And we'll keep coming back to this concept of the time dimension, which we often overlook. We also know that the characteristics that result in these transitions between health and disease, or that herald one of these transitions, for example, sudden cardiac death, are really not well understood. And we've only superficially characterized them to this point. So ultimately, a more profound understanding of health and disease state transitions will allow us to develop more focused preventive measures to provide opportunities for monitoring and targeted preemptive interventions, and hopefully also to inform the development of new therapeutics and new diagnostics. So we also have a tremendous opportunity now to link biology, computing, and analytics with population health. But this has been a major challenge to date, how to bring people and these amazing and accelerating computing capabilities together to leverage them in understanding health and disease state transitions. So I think this highlights some of the challenges, and particularly the time dimension as we're thinking about biomedicine. So we unfortunately we kind of forget that we start here, and somehow we end up with this individual here. And that's an influence not only of time and our biology, but also of the things that we do to ourselves, that our environment does to us, and in this case, perhaps a lot to ourselves. So what we want to do ultimately is incorporate this time dimension, be following people serially over time, not just randomly sampling at the time that an individual happens to make contact with the health system, or we decide that we're going to do a research study that collects some information on them. The other thing that we're not good at is taking kind of a larger systems view of health and disease. We tend to focus on the things we know or the mechanisms that we think are active. So we're looking under the lamppost rather than more broadly casting a light over mechanisms of disease and health. And then, as I highlighted, and I think mixed picture here highlights that we have to figure a way to incorporate into the biology and the time dimension the constructs of social context and behavioral context. So ultimately, we hope to be able to bring those together within the context of the baseline study. So if the world were perfect, we would just jump right in and do this. We would take all that's available to us from the computer, clinical, social sciences, and basic sciences, and we could integrate them seamlessly. We could get data from all of us in our normal environments every day, every moment of what we're doing. And we would collect every dimension. And believe me, we've talked about collecting every dimension in the study, but it does have some invasiveness to it that we think the population really isn't quite ready for, nor are we quite equipped to be able to collect that much information in that much detail. But again, the opportunity to bridge to that construct in the future. So what do we want to do now? So what are our immediate solutions? So we think that development of wearable monitors that can get us continuous information on physiologic parameters and potentially even simple laboratory measurements, alignment of genomic technologies with standard laboratory measures, physiologic testing using the concepts of big data analytic techniques to bring all of these together in big data computing environments that give us a sense of these relationships between the multiple dimensions that we're talking about, which include the biological, the clinical, the environmental information, to develop predictive models, learning systems, continuous quality improvement, all at an individual and a community level. So therein comes the baseline study. And it really is a comprehensive study of human health and transition to disease in the form of a longitudinal cohort where we want to extensively characterize participants at baseline and then serially over the course of time using a battery of clinical and imaging, psychosocial and behavioral, socioeconomic, geospatial, physiometric, and molecular tools. And we'll go in a little more detail into what those are in the next few slides. But all really to achieve these goals of better understanding health and the transitions between health and disease. So these are our objectives. We want to characterize human systems biology by measuring these multiple systems simultaneously and longitudinally, define normal values. And if you think about the lab tests that we're familiar with looking at every day, they're isolated values. They're not derived in the context of multiple other laboratories or other parameters that aren't even considered in developing normal ranges. So we want to define normal values in the context of all of these other measured parameters. Ultimately, we want to be able to predict outcomes, but outcomes that are meaningful to our participants. In this study, we're going to focus on cardiovascular events, new onset or recurrence of cancer, functional status, and quality of life. We want to validate wearable human monitoring devices against well-characterized physiological and clinical measurements and put them in the context of quality of life and functional outcomes. And then, of course, to characterize disease state transitions for cardiovascular disease and cancer, but that also include quality of life and functional status within those domains. So how do we do this? This is kind of a pictorial representation of what we hope to do, and that is to apply a number of traditional and more futuristic, I guess, approaches to characterizing the individual. And that includes omics platforms, looking at immune system and immune competency. Of course, we have to consider conventional things like the family history and family trees, which are very important but not as well understood as we think they are in determining disease onset. We'll use imaging. The traditional tool of the physical exam still hasn't gone away and we think still has much to contribute. And then we'll obviously have standard laboratory tests as well. And the hope then is to take an individual who is healthy and follow him to an unhealthy state. And whether we pick that up through imaging, in this case shown as amyloid plaques, or detecting mutations that lead to cancer, noticing aberrant blood test results, picking them up hopefully early before the onset of disease, and then correlating those to family history and the things we learn from the physical exam. So if we can do this by following people longitudinally, we will hopefully find an individual somewhere between this healthy individual and the unhealthy individual and be able to apply these preemptive strategies. So ultimately, the goals then are to integrate personal and external information or environmental information to enable individuals, neighborhoods, and populations to optimize their health, prevent disease, monitor treatment, and enable functional lifelong capability. So we also then hope that will come from this is an understanding of health and disease that we can use to develop new therapeutics and new diagnostics, but also to leverage this well-characterized population of individuals to be participants in future studies that may help with developing the diagnostics and therapeutics. And then ultimately, if we can do this on a large enough scale, to be able to develop things that are low cost at the individual and on the large scale research or community level. So how are we going to do this? Well, we've created or envision and are in the process of melding that a consortium called the Baseline Consortium that will include Google as the funder and informatics and analytics expertise, with the academic and similar expertise that we can bring from the medical perspective, the analytic perspective of Duke and Stanford. Stanford will serve as an intellectual leader on the construct of cancer with Kelly Markham here at Duke and many others in the Cancer Center supporting that. Duke will serve as a leader on the cardiovascular side with support from Kim Mahaffey, who I know all of you know from his time here at the DCRI, being our counterpart in that domain at Stanford. And ultimately, this concept of Team Purple or the purple baseline study shown here. So mixing the blue and the red with a little bit of Google thrown in, we think we can accomplish what is a pretty almost unbelievably huge undertaking. So how do we get there? Well, there's a pilot going on now that's about 200 participants. It's being led by Terry Shack at the California Health and Living Institute in California, in Los Angeles. It has primarily logistical aims. So can we do all the things that we are saying we want to do? Collect all this information, collect all these samples, get all these images, and do it in a way that's actually efficient and scalable to a 10,000 participant study. And then there's obviously some pre-work on the assays and the data aims. So can we validate the assays that we're using, determine the reliability, and what variability there may be across assays. So technical things that will make it possible for us to have meaningful information that comes from the larger baseline study. Following that, which is ongoing now, then will be the baseline study itself. And this is a broad overview of what we're envisioning, both at the site level and at the participant level. So we see two main centers, Duke and Stanford. Duke will have two sites, one in Kannapolis and one here in Durham, with the projection that about half the participants will be enrolled at Duke and half will be enrolled at Stanford, for a total of 10,000 at least participants enrolled, 5,000 in the cardiovascular disease cohorts and 5,000 in the cancer cohorts. And we can't in 10,000 people cover the entire spectrum of cardiovascular disease or cancer. So we've defined 3 risk buckets in each of the disease areas. And in cardiovascular disease, let me take you through, I don't know if the pointer shows well, but if you look at this diagram, we have cancer risk on the y-axis and cardiovascular risk on the x-axis. There are about 232 million adults over the age of 20 in the US, and that's really our target population. But as I said, we can't easily sample all of them. So we're very interested in normal individuals, so individuals who don't have known cardiovascular disease or cancer, and then will serve as an anchor group to define a reference population. And we're saying roughly a quarter of the individuals will be enrolled into that bucket. And then in cancer, we'll define a genetically and environmentally high-risk population, so individuals with known genetic mutations or exposure to cigarette smoke, so heavy smokers, who are at high risk for developing a first cancer. And then we'll have a cohort that has cancer and is at high risk for developing recurrent cancer, so that we have a normal reference population, we're able to look at transitions to disease, but in a time frame that will allow us to pick up events over a 5-year period of the study. In cardiovascular disease, similarly, we will sample a relatively healthy population. We'll use the Framingham risk score and the pooled populations risk score to define individuals with less than a 5% likelihood of developing a cardiovascular event or known coronary disease during that 5-year period. We'll also then sample for a higher risk population who doesn't have known cardiovascular disease, but who is at high risk for developing their first cardiovascular event, again, using the Framingham risk model and the pooled risk equation. And these individuals will have at least a 20% risk of developing a cardiovascular event, death MI, or stroke over this 5-year period of the study. And then we'll define a high-risk cardiovascular cohort, and that's a group of individuals who have known cardiovascular disease and are at high risk for developing either sudden cardiac death or the next cardiovascular event. And for that, we'll take advantage of a model that we created out of some of the early Murdoch work using the CathGen data set. We expect to enroll pretty aggressive timelines, and I think, when you hear these, one of your questions might be, can we get this all done at Duke and Stanford? And it's possible that we'll have to bring in other sites, but we're looking to all of you and our collective efforts to be able to do this. But we hope to enroll 2,000 cancer and 2,000 cardiovascular disease participants in the first year, and then another 2,000 and 2,000 in the second year, and then finish out that last 2,000 individuals in the third year, and then have roughly 2.5 years of follow-up on median over the course of the next the full 5 years. How do we think we can do this? Well, we know we have large populations within our health systems at Duke and Stanford. We have the Murdoch study, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We have a DCRU volunteer registry where we hope that we'll find a number of individuals to populate the normal buckets, and then we'll take advantage of our cancer center, and in particular our high-risk cancer clinic to help find the individuals who fall into that genetic high risk or smoking high risk population. We'll stratify by age. We're interested in oversampling the older population, so 65 and above, and then we'll stratify to make sure we're representative of the US population in terms of race and ethnicity. Obviously, the Stanford site brings in the opportunity to recruit within the Asian and Hispanic population, and we've done obviously very well in Murdoch in the Hispanic population, and we have excellent efforts in the Durham community to recruit African American and Hispanic populations as well. So this is a schematic that Vicki Christian put together, which we've all really liked, which kind of gives you this overall picture of what we're going to do. We have our 3 sites at in Durham, in Cabarrus County, the Duke sites. We have our Stanford sites that will be contributing participants. We'll be putting them into these buckets of risk, from no risk of disease to high risk of disease. We're very hopeful here that one of our strategies will be to use what we refer to as the magic donut, which is a way to algorithmically screen our health system data to identify high likelihood individuals that meet these bucket requirements so that we can more efficiently approach participants. So this gives you an overall idea of what we hope to do. This is what it looks like for a participant. They will be pre-screened, as I just showed you, using a variety of existing databases, but also this opportunity to screen our electronic health records. We will approach them. If they agree to participate, there will be a web consent through a portal that will allow us to collect some additional screening information. If they still meet the main inclusion-exclusion criteria at that point, they'll be invited to an in-person visit where they will undergo formal written informed consent, be enrolled into the study. Then we will, through a participant portal, an internet web-based portal, we will follow them quarterly each year for additional questionnaires, for event status, and to keep them engaged with the study. So we'll have a number of things that are both of benefit to them and that get us the information that we need to keep close contact on them from the study purposes. They'll come back each year for an in-person visit, and we'll look at the schedule of assessments here in a minute. And then we'll have available to the sites and to the participants a 24-hour participant portal that's backed up by a person on a helpline, so that we have contact and ability to communicate with these individuals pretty exquisitely over time, and if things come up, to get them referred to our community physicians and stay engaged with that population as well. So what are we? So what happens to these people? And you can probably tell from the first few slides, this is going to be pretty intensive characterization of the population. So they'll get the usual things that we do: the history and physical exam that will include a component of an eye history and physical, and a hearing history and physical, not just here to here, but really a complete physical exam. We're using a tool called MeTree, which is a way to collect family history in substantial detail. And then they'll have usual measurements like their blood pressure and their height and weight, ankle brachial index, which is a comparison of the upper extremity and lower extremity blood pressures to look for peripheral vascular disease. So those are kind of standard routine things that we normally do. They'll also have a large battery of routine clinical laboratories that are shown here. Everything from the complete blood count and your kidney and liver function, to your vitamin D and hormone levels, to your mercury and other heavy metal levels. So intensive characterization across a battery of routine clinical laboratories. Then there will be a set of specific assessments that are directly related to either including or excluding participants from the study, or to complete characterization. So all participants will have 12-lead electrocardiogram and chest x-ray at baseline, and you can see how these play out. Most of these things are done again at every yearly assessment, with the exception of the radiologic studies. They'll have a complete eye exam, meaning visual acuity, contrast acuity, and then special imaging of their retinas and the layers of their eyes. They'll have pulmonary function testing, so to test how their lungs work. And then they'll have audiometry or hearing tests that we do that are phone or web-based. The cardiology participants will get coronary calcium scoring, which is a way to look at calcium in the coronary arteries, which is a signal or a risk sign for cardiovascular disease and potential cardiovascular events, so heart attacks down the road. And then we'll do echocardiograms or ultrasounds of the heart and stress tests on all of the cardiovascular cohort individuals, so 5,000 individuals, and we'll do those every other year for the duration of the study. The cancer cohorts will be followed as standard of care, and particularly in cancer cohorts 2, which is the high-risk genetic or exposure cohort, and cancer cohort 3, which is the group that has existing cancer and is at risk for recurrence. There are standard guidelines for how those individuals are followed, either with imaging or with blood testing, like for tumor markers, things like CA-125. Those will be done in the context of clinical care, and we will collect those images and results and merge them into the baseline study database. So there won't be any additional specific testing for those cohorts, but we'll have a lot of particularly imaging information. Then I mentioned that we also want to understand socioeconomic, behavioral context. So we'll have a number of screening tools that we'll use either through the web or in person when the individuals are at their visit, that measure psychosocial and behavioral, diet, and functional status. Many of these we've used in the Murdoch study and actually find that the participants very much like doing them, and it's a means to keep them engaged in the study. And we plan or are working through our plan for how we get some of this information back to the participants as part of keeping them invested in the study. Then we're going to collect a lot of specimens. So a large opportunity that we have here is molecular characterization of these individuals, in addition to the standard clinical laboratories, clinical exam and history, and our standard imaging tests. So we'll collect urine, saliva, tears, plasma and serum. We'll collect things for RNA and DNA. We're even going to collect stool and swabs behind their ears and over their tongues and in their noses. So this is a pretty intense characterization to be able to look at things like the microbiome, the bacteria that inhabit our body, and to think about and learn how they influence health and disease, or how they may change or be a harbinger of a new illness. And then to understand, particularly has been studied in the context of cancer, this concept of exhaled breath, which may, for volatile compounds, which may provide some insights there. It may also help us understand the environment, what we're breathing, and the comparisons between what comes out and what's in the air around us. So there's some really kind of futuristic things also that we're doing here that we'll do in subsets of the participants. And then we'll collect biopsies as they're available from the participants who have cancer. And I think probably the most striking thing, and I think the thing that has our team perhaps the most worried about the acceptance, is this 300 mLs of blood. And everybody's probably thinking, like, what's 300 mLs of blood? But if you think about it, it's about that much blood. So think about a can of Coke. So that's a fair bit of blood, and we'll have to work on that. But we think it gives us a number of opportunities that I think will be paid huge dividends down the road. So I don't want to scare off anyone in the room who's thinking they want to participate. We'll work through this with you, and we'll get there. What are we going to do with all this blood? Well, this is what we intend to do with all this blood. And I think anybody who's worked in this arena understands what a huge opportunity it is to have funding to do tests across all of these dimensions. These are not inconsequential in either scope or cost to do this. So it is a lot of blood, but it is also a tremendous opportunity to actually analyze samples and study the data that comes from them. So to give you an idea of the data that we'll be generating when we look at DNA, RNA, metabolites, and proteins, just the kind of fundamental building blocks of the human, and we put those all together, it's about 3.7, 3.8 terabytes of data. So this starts to put you into this construct of why we need this collaboration with Google. Not only does it help us with resources to do all this, but certainly the computing capability that it will take to collate this data, make it research ready, and then analyze it is both a tremendous opportunity but a tremendous undertaking. But we do think that it will provide a number of opportunities and a partnership with the capabilities to process this complex phenotypic, biochemical, and genomic data. And then as if that was not enough, we're going to add all of these imaging studies on that, which themselves are tremendous amounts of data when we start thinking about the individual units of data which are in these images. So just a chest x-ray, a digital chest x-ray, has somewhere between 8 and 32 megabytes of data. If we move to things like stress echoes and MRIs, we're up to 600 megabytes of data for an individual study. And what Google has talked about is not just wanting the processed images, but wanting the actual raw data from the images. And you can imagine that by having that raw data and not being constrained by convention, the signals that they might be able to discover using the raw data. And those are gigabyte or multi-gigabyte quantities of data. So add that to the molecular data, and you can see we're clearly moving into this big data environment and era. So we're also going to be collecting data from wearable physiometric devices, which are still under development. So I can't tell you a whole lot about them, but suffice it to say they'll look somewhat like a wristwatch, and we'll collect data across a number of parameters that we hope will be easy for participants to wear and provide us this kind of temporal context and real-time data feed that we've had a hard time really collecting before this era of the wearable devices. So this is a look at what it takes to store and manage all of these data. The cloud on a slide, I guess, is a good way to say it. But it's, again, just to impress that it's really a tremendous undertaking and awe-inspiring in many ways. This is what the data flow will look like. This is a diagram that's been laid out by the Google team and that our team has been discussing with them. You can see there are inputs that come from participants, that come from the biospecimen collection, that come directly from the participant into the database, which is the wearable devices. And then we have the participant portal where participants are entering their own data. What's called the Site Research Database, this is actually what the DCRI Coordinating Center will be developing, our ECOS database as part of the coordinating center. So if you wonder kind of where we are on this diagram, The portal will be developed by Google in collaboration with Eric Wong and Shelley Rusinkovich and our team here, who are giving a lot of insight on that. And then the laboratories will all be managed by a number of outside vendors, and including LabCorp will have to get integrated into this construct. In the end, this integrated database called the Baseline Study Database will be a hub for processing this information and making it research ready, which will then be available to us, Duke and Stanford, and the Google investigators. And the proposal is that there's a period of 21 months of data exclusivity for us, meaning broadly Duke, Stanford, to do all the things that we want to do. So we have a real opportunity here to be creative and engage broadly in looking at these data and both exploring, developing hypotheses, testing hypotheses before the data then ultimately are made available broadly for qualified research partners through a process of application for the data.
When does that clock start?
That's a great question, and if we had all those answers worked out, but the general idea is that the data will be accruing over time. We intend to look at the data as a study group on roughly monthly basis, and then we'll make some decisions about when a tranche of data is ready to be called final or whatever you want to say, and let people go at it. So it'll probably come out in groupings over time, and then the 21-month period would start from there. So that was the Google neat and clean line diagram. This is a nice diagram that Cindy Klucher and Brian McCourt and their group came up with to show really how complex this is. There are only 3 sites, but the complexity of what we're asking to be done with a participant portal, an ECOS database, electronic health records, laboratories that are coming from multiple vendors is of an order of magnitude complexity from the usual, I guess, randomized clinical trials. So the role of the coordinating center here is not so much to make sure 3 sites are all pulling in the same direction. They are, and we'll coordinate the services for those. But a huge portion of what we're doing is our operational statistics and our operational analytics to make sure that the things that we're getting are of high quality, that they're getting to the right people at the right time, so that we can actually monitor the study, make sure we're enrolling and collecting quality samples, but also that we can look at the study, make adjustments as we need to as we're going, and provide feedback to the sites and the participants in nearly real time. So this is a complex undertaking. The diagram is impressive, and what the team is going to be doing is even more impressive to make this all work. So I've talked kind of at a high level about what we're intending to do in the baseline study, and you can imagine that there's some things in there that we don't want to just drop on people or on the community. So community engagement to prepare for the baseline study will be a big undertaking for us over the first probably 3 to 6 months after we actually have a contract to move forward. So I think everyone here is aware there's a number of key principles in thinking about community engagement. The first and the thing that we really want to emphasize is that these individuals as volunteers and the community are really participants and partners in the research. We're not treating them as study subjects or research subjects. We want them to be fully engaged and helping shape what we do and participating. So that we, as a group and between the communities and the individuals and the study team, have trust. We want the community to feel like they have ownership of the study rather than just being studied, and ultimately yielding pride in their participation and this sense of altruism that we're really going to need to learn the things that we want to learn collectively from this effort. I show a few of the efforts in the Durham community that I think are examples of what's already ongoing in terms of community engagement, but that hopefully we can leverage and bring those efforts together in the context of the baseline study, including the CTSA's population research efforts, the Durham Diabetes Coalition, and the collaboration that's been established there between the County Health Department and Duke. And then we have Lincoln, which sees a large portion of the Durham community that's underserved, but now is integrated in their health records with Duke. And I highlighted just a number of kind of common questions, and these are things that have come up in Murdoch, and I think come up every time we engage people in an undertaking like this. They want to know what's going to happen. What do they get back from participating? How will we keep their information private? The community wants to know what we're going to do with all of this information, and how will it be used, and how will they have access to it. What are the benefits for participating? So can we give back to the community? Can we give back advice on screening? Can we give back advice on healthy diet, or things like that that are value added for being a part of being in the study? And then Murdoch, the Murdoch study is centered down in Kannapolis, and Ashley Dunham, who's our project leader over that study, is here today. But it's been a tremendous undertaking over the last, 6 or 7 years, that started with at least a year to almost 2 years of community engagement. And through that, we had 1,000 people lined up ready to join the Murdoch study. And we think we're going to need that same kind of grassroots effort in the baseline study. These are a few of the coordinators who are based down in Kannapolis, and this is a picture from one of our recent community engagement events this fall. So you get an idea of the team that it takes to get out there in the community and be part of the community, to invest the community in their participation. We really get out to where people live, work, and play, and that's what it takes to create the visibility, but also the sense of community to pull off something like this. We have a network in Cabarrus County of sites that bring diversity in our recruitment, and we'll have to have that same kind of feeling and sense amongst our local providers here in the Durham community. And this includes community-free clinics, the federally qualified health center, as well as private practices and specialty practices. And I think I would highlight that we can through community engagement, enroll a diverse population. And Murdoch's recruited now about 11,000 participants. And when we first started, not surprisingly, our volunteers were mostly white, older women. We might argue that many of them are still women. We're working on that. But one of the things we really wanted to focus on was representing the ethnic and racial diversity in the community. And through community engagement efforts, we were able to, over a period of just 12 months, go from about 2% African American enrollment to about 12% African American enrollment. And similarly, with an effort focused on the Hispanic population with bilingual recruiters and individuals who lived in the community, were able to go from about 2% to about 13 or 14% Hispanic population. So we think those kinds of efforts will be necessary, and we need to build that in up front, but also prepare the community for that. We also, I think, can take a lesson from Murdoch in our community and healthcare advisory boards, which bring together leaders in the healthcare system and leaders in the community across a number of diverse organizations, churches, schools, and businesses to advise and participate in shaping the study and the things we do. So these are all efforts that we'll need to be thinking about in this early startup period for baseline. We also use the community to engage the community. So our participants are our best ambassadors to the community, and we'll try to take that lesson to the baseline study as well, and hopefully we'll engage many of the participants who are already enrolled in Murdoch in participating further in the baseline study. This is our study leadership. Rob is the Duke representative on the executive leadership. Sam Gambier is the chair of radiology at Stanford, is the leader from Stanford, and Andy Conrad is the leader of the Google efforts. And then I want to conclude just with this slide, and I want to thank Vicki for helping me come up with this. I give her full credit. We needed something that could just reflect the sense of community and collective engagement in getting us to the point where we are today and what I've showed you. And we've had a tremendous effort and support from our colleagues in ophthalmology and radiology and in the Cancer Center and the Echo Lab, and putting together our site-based efforts here at Duke. We've had similar efforts with Paul Campbell as our local PI, with Ashley and Leah and her team down in Kannapolis to pull together the Carolinas health system and our local CMC Northeast colleagues on that front. Obviously, it's a collaboration with Google, the laboratories, the Murdoch study, so I can't name everyone individually or I'd leave out some of the hundreds of people who have been engaged, but it's been a big effort so far, and I think only that spirit of collaboration and participation will get us to realizing that goal of 5,000 participants in 3 years across Durham and Kannapolis. So with that, I'll stop and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Well, my question is easy. When can I sign up?
Hey, we will make a list right now.
Thank you. This is great. Questions from the audience? Remember, we got speakers in the, go ahead.
Dr. Newby, could you tell me someone on your team that I could talk to about your consent process that you plan on using? I'd be very interested in learning more about that.
Absolutely. So we have been incredibly fortunate to have Laura Beskow involved in designing our consent form. And I don't know if Laura's here today. I think she may be out of town.
She has already submitted something to the IRB on this.
Yeah, but she's been very engaged, and we would be happy to share what we've done. I think it's I think it will be a model for this kind of research going forward.
I'm sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In the plethora of data points that you're gathering, would you be conducting anything on sleep?
Interesting question. So there's nothing we haven't talked about. There was a lot of interest in a sleep component, a sleep questionnaire, a ping through the wearable devices every day to tell us how you slept. And we ultimately decided, for a number of reasons, that we would collect whatever activity and things we collect through the wearable devices, but we would withhold putting everyone through the invasiveness of asking them every morning how they slept, for fear they wouldn't sleep knowing that they were going to have to answer the questions. But one of the things that we have built into this is what we call a quantified self sub-study. So For the group of participants who are interested in being more thoroughly probed and questioned, we'll have that opportunity, and we see that as kind of an ancillary part of what we do. And there will be plenty of opportunity for mini sub-studies or additional characterization like that.
Eric?
So, congratulations on many fronts, not the least of which is probably the most beautiful sets of slides I've ever seen.
So I have to share credit for that with Suresh and Vicki and Ashley and Rob and others, but thank you.
Two questions, neither that easy. The first of which is, although you have a huge sample of 10,000 patients, how many events, which is going to in part associate with how many variables you can test for association, do you imagine? And how do you guard against the degree to which correlations are going to appear now that may or may not be real and just by chance alone? That's the first question.
Okay.
The second is related to the sleep question. What keeps you up at night most about
So the second question, what keeps me up most at night, is just getting everything done. I guess the what keeps me up at night. The first thing I guess I've already highlighted is 10,000 participants in 3 years is a lot. And we're asking a lot of these participants, and if I had to say there's one thing of what we're asking of them that I'm probably the most worried about, is the 300 mLs of blood. And
Is that 300 mLs a year or over 4 years?
it's a year. It's a year. And then if they have events, we'll get a little bit more. I didn't give you full disclosure, but and just how participants are gonna react to that. So that's kind of thinking about it from the participant perspective. I let Rob do more of the worrying about the contract and when that gets done. But it's been a huge. It really has been a huge effort putting together this scope and budget and making it all work. And I don't want to convey in any way that it's been easy and that we're completely through that. There's a lot of work yet to do. So I guess, getting from now until that first patient in, there's, I guess, a lot that will keep me occupied at night when I probably don't want to be examined for my sleep patterns. The first question, I think is a good one. And even over the last couple of weeks, as we're working on the protocol, this has come up. And I saw, and I think he ducked out before I could call on him. Joe, where's Joe Lucas? Oh, Michael. There's Michael and Joe. So I'm gonna call on them in a minute because they've actually put some thought into this even very recently and owe me some material for the protocol. When we look at these buckets, so we estimate that there's going to be somewhere over a 2.5-year period, somewhere around 400 or so cardiovascular events in the high-risk cohort, somewhere around 150 to 200 in the intermediate cardiovascular cohort. We expect the normal cohorts to have 0 to a handful of events. So we're not worried about that group. And some of the question has been, can we shade to fewer people in the normal buckets to get more events, particularly in the cancer cohorts, which are even lower event rate populations than the cardiovascular cohort. So I'm going to turn to Michael and Joe because they have actually just recently run some sample size and power calculations thinking about at least hypothesis testing. So maybe I can get you guys to give a comment or two on that. Michael or Joe?
Well, I guess one of the questions is, can we develop biosignatures with this data that's going to predict or identify early disease or predict outcomes and that sort of thing? Haven't really heard any really specific hypotheses for which you might do a power calculation or anything like that, but so I think it's sort of unclear how well it's going to work out in that regard. I think it would be too bad though, because I really like the healthy cohort personally.
Kristen, don't you
It's
think
hard
it's
to,
worth?
it's hard to define normal, right? And a lot of this is exploratory, and the opportunity then existing to either recruit additional populations or to do kind of a test and validation. So to find something on the early cohorts, test it in the later cohorts. So kind of a more traditional discovery and validation approach. So, Michael?
Well, yeah, let me add, I guess, a couple of things. So first, this is not the most hypothesis-driven study that I've been involved in, and so let's admit it. The number of events that we'll need is proportional to the time we're going to follow this cohort. So the longer we go, and I think there is some at least verbal commitment that this would be longer, the more events will accumulate. As an analogy, when Framingham started in the 50s, I don't think how many hypotheses they had, and then now they published over 2,000 papers. And I guess if you wanted to control for multiple testing, Framingham would have been done many years ago, so I don't think we're going to be worrying about that. But the issue is real. How soon can we do a more meaningful analysis? And with the event rates we're projecting, we could detect a significant biomarker with effect size of 0.3, 0.4, which is on the larger end. But we're kind of engaging more in this discussion and trying to see what we will be able to do.
Last question, go ahead.
Well, it's not so much, it's not a question, it's more of a comment. I don't think we have to admit that this is not hypothesis driven. One could argue that the hypothesis obsession, especially at the NIH, has led to thousands of totally useless studies that prove that one transgenic mouse relates to another. And, you know, we are banking on the concept that this is just the leading edge of something that's going to happen anyway. And so it's a fact that, you know, we're hoping this will go well beyond 5 years, and that there will be much larger populations involved, and that follow-up will be very inexpensive because of electronic health records. But I'd also point out, you know, the analogy I've been using, let's say you're a ENT doctor who's interested in hearing. That's something I've been interested in lately as I get older. I can't hear anything in a restaurant, for example. Who's ever had 10,000 people that had really good hearing testing and also had their gene sequence, their retina visualized, and 450 proteins measured all at the same time? And so if you said the degree to which you can hear different tones is an outcome, we are way overpowered for that outcome. So there's a lot of intermediate stuff here that's going to be fascinating to look at that's just never been seen before, because we only look at what we're limited to be able to look at and afford up till now.
One more question, Judy.
I just, I was going to ask a question, make a comment, and you just stimulated thought again. As I was listening to this, first of all, Kristin, congratulations, it's really impressive effort. But we call it a baseline study with our focus on clinical trials, but really, from a big picture perspective, we're talking about a reproduction of a massive epidemiologic study, the likes of Framingham, as Michael said, or the Washington County study, where we've learned so much, and they didn't know when they started those studies that the fingernails that they collected would yield very valuable information. So Rob, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I completely congratulate this effort. It's really impressive. Adding the patient engagement, your wisdom to do that will make the whole thing successful, and I certainly hope you'll be able to extend the time, because that's
So Doc, I do feel obligated to say two things. First, thanks to a great team. I think Kristin did a beautiful job of explaining how much human interaction has been involved here in putting this together. But also to remind everybody, we don't have a contract on this project. Point. So this is all our best thinking. We do have a contract for this design, and we, you know, as you can tell, we're pretty much done with it, and we are, you know, in discussions about the budget. I think things look really good, but it's possible we've just done the greatest thought exercise in my career. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's going to work out, and it should be a lot of fun for a lot of people.
Thank you, Kristin. Thanks, everybody, for